So this, of course, is the big story of the moment, concern over the mounting casualties in the Israel-Hamas war. The American administration, which has a lot of leverage on Tel Aviv, is now trying to persuade Israel to try and change the strategy that Israel has deployed. Washington has sent its White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan to Israel. Sullivan has met with the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu in Tel Aviv in an attempt to try and convince the Israelis the importance of protecting civilian lives. Now, according to a White House statement, Jake Sullivan and Netanyahu discussed the possibility of shifting from high-intensity clearing operations to undertaking some low-intensity surgical operations.
He did talk about possible transitioning from what we would call high-intensity operations, which is what we're seeing them do now, to lower-intensity operations sometime, in the near future. But I don't want to put a timestamp.
And also, John Kirby said that Washington wants to see the war end as soon as possible. But the American spokesperson again added a bit of a rider, saying that it is Hamas that has the ultimate responsibility for ending this conflict.
If Hamas would release all the hostages, lay down their arms, and surrender up those responsible for the October 7th attacks.
Now, Israel, remember, has vowed to keep fighting. It has imposed a complete siege of the Gaza Strip and has continued with its devastating campaign of air bombings and also its ground offensive. Now, the Israeli Prime Minister has claimed that even though there is a lot of pain and there is a lot of international pressure because of the mounting civilian casualties and the humanitarian catastrophe in the Gaza Strip, there is nothing that Netanyahu says that will now stop the Israeli forces under him.
I see there is the start of an understanding that we are determined to continue until the end and to destroy this entity.
Now, despite the repeated American expressions of concern, Israel has not shown any signs of heeding the United States' calls for showing and exercising a certain level of restraint to protect civilian lives. A new U.S. intelligence assessment has said that nearly about 40 to 45% of the 29,000 air-to-ground ammunitions that Israel used in bombing the Gaza Strip were all dumb bombs. That means that these bombs were fired randomly at unspecified targets. Now, these unguided missiles are in fact taking a huge toll on civilian lives, especially in these very densely populated areas. And the rate at which Israel is using the dumb bombs, it's unlikely that it can stem the soaring civilian death toll. No wonder then that the United States President Joe Biden is also facing a lot of backlash at home for his unequivocal support to the Israeli war. But remember, bear in mind, the Americans are the ones who are also supplying the Israelis with a lot of these dumb bombs. In the beginning of this month, Vice President Kamala Harris had urged her colleagues at the White House to show more concern publicly for the humanitarian damage in the Gaza Strip.
As Israel defends itself, it matters how. The United States is unequivocal. International humanitarian law must be respected. Too many innocent Palestinians have been killed. Frankly, the scale of civilian suffering and the images and videos coming from Gaza are devastating.
Now, the United States has provided billions of dollars of weapons and ammunition and bombs that Israel has been dropping on the Gaza Strip. Nearly about 15,000 bombs and some 57,000 artillery shells have in fact been sent by Washington to Tel Aviv. A lot of the weapons that were meant to go to Ukraine are also being redirected to the Israelis. The United States has also provided diplomatic cover in the face of overwhelming international condemnation for Israel's conduct in this war, notably by vetoing a United Nations Security Council resolution that would have demanded for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. So far, Netanyahu has rejected the US plan and is now betting his political survival on opposing the authorities' role in post-war Gaza. But this is, of course, going to be pretty difficult for the United States, and it now remains to be seen as to how this will play out diplomatically. And also to give us more perspective on this, we're being joined by Professor Scott Lucas, who is a professor of international politics at the Clinton Institute in the University College Dublin. Is joining us live from Birmingham in the United Kingdom. Professor, let me in fact begin by asking you this. What we've witnessed over the course of the last few days is that the United States appears to have changed its stance to a certain extent in the way it has been backing Israel. It is urging Tel Aviv to exercise more restraint to ensure that the civilian casualties that are being witnessed in the Gaza Strip are not as bad as what is being witnessed. Do you think the Americans can actually prevail over Tel Aviv?
I think you summarized it in that while the Americans have changed their rhetoric, talk is cheap in the context of actions. Actions which, after Hamas's killing of more than 1,200 people, most of them Israeli civilians and foreign nationals, has wound up killing now almost 19,000 people in Gaza since October 7th, the large majority of them civilians. If the United States was serious about curbing the Israeli air and ground attacks, they could have done one of two things, which you mentioned. They could have earlier this week cast their veto in the UN Security Council, they could have refrained from casting their veto in the UN Security Council earlier this week on a resolution calling for a ceasefire, therefore giving the diplomatic signal that this offensive should be halted. Or secondly, they could cut or restrict their military assistance to Israel. But far from doing that, American officials, I suspect American officials who are not happy with what is going on, leaked to the media last week that the United States since October the 7th has provided more than 15,000 bombs and more than 50,000 shells to Israel. More than 10,000 of those 15,000 bombs, as you mentioned, are unguided bombs. They're not precise. They don't target fighters. They kill civilians as well. Despite that coming out, Joe Biden last Friday, even as he said civilian casualties should be limited, asked Congress to authorize another 45,000 tank shells to Israel. Tank shells which would not be used to defend Israel, but in an offensive. So no, I'm sorry. Joe Biden, Jake Sullivan, Kamala Harris, you don't have leverage over Israel because you gave up your leverage over Israel. And no statements you make, no statements that Jake Sullivan matter publicly today if there is not a private challenge to the Israeli War Cabinet to stop this killing of civilians as well as of Hamas fighters. And if you don't stop this killing of civilians, we will call for a ceasefire and we will restrict the military shipments.
And also, Professor Lucas, how isolated do you think the United States has become on the international scene because of its backing of Israel? We've been witnessing as to how, this issue has been voted upon both in the UNSC and also in the UNGA, where unequivocally there are nations that have been demanding that there should be a humanitarian ceasefire, but the United States is the one that has used its veto at the UNSC to block a resolution demanding for the ceasefire.
Well, I think, again, clearly you summarized it, and that is there have been a number of countries who have not yet called for a ceasefire. Indeed, the European Union at its summit today in Brussels is unlikely to call for a ceasefire while they are moving towards calling for more humanitarian aid. But in that Security Council of 15 members earlier this week, 13 voted for a ceasefire, including France, including Asian members. The United Kingdom abstained on the resolution. Only the U.S. votes no.
Absolutely.
In the General Assembly, a couple of days later, when an overwhelming 153 of 193 nations call for a ceasefire, countries like France, Japan, Australia vote for the ceasefire. The U.S. again votes no. So no, I mean, there is no moral as well as political high ground that the U.S. can claim right now when it is seen as enabling, not just standing aside from, but enabling the ongoing killing in Gaza.
Absolutely indeed, Professor Lucas. Thank you very much indeed for joining us with that perspective there.
Thank you.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.